Hey, this is Desality, and welcome to episode 12 of 90s Overlooked Underheard. So, yeah, welcome back if you've been following this series. If you haven't, and I don't do this recap often enough, so I really should. This is just my rundown through 50 of my favourite records, which I happen to think might have been overlooked or underheard, certainly underrated, not talked about, from the 1990s. And I'm going through it chronologically, or as close as I can. I usually try and come up with a link which kind of ties together two of the artists, if I'm talking about two artists, in each video. And the best I can come up with today is kind of, these are very different takes on DIY kind of artists. Yeah, so let's kick off. And the first album I'm talking about today is Tool of the Man by Poster Children, which was released sometime in 1993. So, yeah, Poster Children, they formed in college in Champaign, Illinois, which is a kind of a university town, city, a few hours outside of Chicago. And they formed around the core duo of Rose Marshak on bass and backing vocals, and Rick Valentin. They did eventually become husband and wife, so this is one of those husband and wife bands. Throughout their time, they had multiple drummers, and by the time they got to Tool of the Man, they'd actually settled on the guitarist who would stay playing with them for the rest of their career, up until the present day, in fact, who happened to be Rick's brother, Jim Valentin. Prior to this album, they'd recorded an EP and a couple of albums with some kind of heavyweight kind of Chicago-based recording mainstays, namely Ian Burgess, famous for recording a lot of Big Black stuff, and speaking of Big Black, Steve Albini, whilst he was still recording at his kind of home studio. So the Poster Children, they offer up this kind of like a pop punk kind of sound, but it's definitely much more of a kind of a Midwest noise rock kind of focused take on that kind of pop punk post-hardcore sound. So there are elements of kind of like, you know, tighter kind of clipped, more poppy kind of almost new wave kind of elements, but mixed with some of the noisier kind of elements of some of the post-hardcore bands of the period. I did in a previous episode, we talked about the band Arc Welder. I'd say they share a lot of kind of similarities with a band like Arc Welder in terms of their songwriting style and their sound. At this particular time in the 90s, there were quite a lot of bands who were kind of getting a name for themselves, performing in a very similar style, I think. So bands like Seam, who you remember we might have talked about in one of our first videos about when we were talking about Bitch Magnet. Bands like Superchunk, Tsunami, Scrawl maybe, Built to Spill, Lotion, even Velocity Girl, who kind of veered a bit towards the shoegaze, but was still playing in a similar kind of vein. I guess you would call this kind of quite a generic American indie rock style. And I mean generic in the kindest possible way there. I'm just trying to kind of group these things together. The one thing most of these bands weren't, I think, is lo-fi, and that became a very definite, I think, branch off of this kind of brand of indie rock. So this album, Tool of the Man, this is another of the fruits of the kind of that grunge major label feeding frenzy, where lots of major labels were looking to sign bands in the wake of Nirvana's success. So Poster Children, in fact, signed to Sire. It was recorded by Mike McMakin, who'd worked with Bitch Magnet, as we talked about, I think it was in episode 2. And he'd also recorded an album or two by Codeine. So to break down key tracks on Tool of the Man, I think the tracks broadly fall into kind of two categories on Tool of the Man. There are the kind of the poppier numbers, the tighter kind of streamlined, faster melodic numbers, kind of kind of like grunge, but definitely dialed in a bit more, dialed back a bit more. Not so kind of hairy and rocky, but much kind of tighter and cleaner and more clipped and more kind of new wave. I think that's pretty fair. And the other category of songs on the album are the ones where the band were a bit looser and were kind of acknowledging their kind of noise rock debt a bit more, using trickier arrangements, more aggressive, more abrasive sounds. To pick up a couple of tracks then, tracks like Clock Street on side 1 or Outside In on side 2. Clock Street happened to be the single that they did release from this album, certainly in the UK. And these are kind of more bouncy, propulsive, upbeat, kind of punky numbers. But they still have these kind of little interesting twists, turns, dynamic things going on, changes in time signature, just odd little things to kind of throw you off and introduce a bit of interest. It's a really cool kind of poppy sound, and it definitely offers a lot more than the kind of Ramalama kind of, old school punk vibe that a lot of pop punk post-hardcore bands were doing in the US at the time. I mean, Outside In even features almost like a little country kind of lick thrown in with this kind of strange kind of hoedown kind of guitar solo. I don't know if it's meant ironically or not, but it works in the terms of the song. They're both pretty cool kind of poppy numbers. In terms of the other kind of moodier, more expressive kind of songs, Redline is a good one, which kind of veers between this kind of lurching, lunging, kind of burping, grungy guitar, heavy guitar sounds, and these kind of short, little tricky verse bridge sections. And it's got some really kind of neat little vocal hooks with the song's title just basically forming the chorus. Kind of quite anthemic, just thrown in the middle of this quite, disturbed, quite heavy sounding song. And I think later on side 2, again, they do something similar with Idiot Show, which if anything is kind of more angry. It's slower and churning, and there's a lot more feedback on it. It's got these little interludes of kind of dialed down, quiet, kind of resigned chorus bridge sections, but this sounds like the Poster Children kind of a bit pissed off. This is their noise rock kind of sound. This is them in noise rock mode. And it's pretty cool, I have to say. So I said at the beginning about DIY. A lot of bands that were signed felt kind of pressured, or felt that, the route was there for them to do the major label thing, to do the tour buses, to do the kind of the riders and have the roadies and the road crews and, the big productions and lots of time in the studio. And a lot of them kind of came to regret those decisions, I think, because that leads kind of one way. That tends to lead to bands getting into debt with their labels. And it's just kind of a mess. The Poster Children made a decision pretty early on that they were going to stay very grounded, stay hands-on, keep control of everything themselves as much as they could. So, they drove their own tour bus. They didn't spend a lot of money. They were quite frugal. And they've turned it into a kind of a long career. They're still releasing albums to this day. I think the real interesting area where they were truly DIY is they were very, very early adopters of using the internet. And if you think about it, in this time, 1993, going through to the next couple of years, we were really talking kind of, dial-up internet. Very early days. No Google, nothing like that. GeoCities, Angel Fire, news groups. You needed to code in HTML. That was pretty much all there was. So to get on board with that so early is credit to them, I think. I think Rose and Rick did work in computer programming, so they had a background in that. But from very early days, they were kind of blogging effectively, and they were writing tour diaries online. They were always on top of the technology. They were always looking for something else to do because they could do it themselves. Multimedia CDs, enhanced CDs, doing their own artwork. And I think staying hands-on was the way to survive this kind of weird post-grunge kind of phase. And the Poster Children made a very good job of it. So, on to our second band today. And actually, it's just one man. Although it sounds like a band. This is East River Pipe, and I'm going to talk about their album from November of '93, Goodbye California. Yeah, so basically a one-man band. This is FM Cornog. I think the F stands for Frederick, but he always goes under the name FM Cornog, who's been described in various places as kind of the Brian Wilson of home recording. We'll talk a little more about that later, but I just thought I'd get that out there now. Cornog, his life, he had quite a difficult early life, and after leaving school he kind of bummed around quite a few kind of dead-end jobs, carpet warehouses, working in a light bulb factory, all sorts of things, and he kind of went off the rails a bit, having issues with alcohol and drug dependency, and ultimately ended up living on the street, ended up homeless, sleeping in the railway station in Hoboken, I believe, New Jersey. And it was whilst he was homeless, he was taken in by someone who'd heard some of his earlier tapes, who gave him a roof over his head and basically gave him kind of a chance, really, at kind of getting his life back on track. And it was in this kind of stage of his life that he started home recording again, using a kind of a Tascam cassette or tape-based kind of multi-track, and just recording with very, very simple gear, very, very little in the way of money or effects, and just doing it from someone else's house who was happy enough to kind of put him up. The person was Barbara Powers, who he did eventually end up marrying. So, yeah, his songwriting. We said earlier about him being the Brian Wilson of home recording. It's weird. I think his songwriting, in a way, is much more like a very downtrodden kind of Springsteen. He does chronicle kind of blue-collar lives and people's, everyday issues. The protagonists of all his songs are very grounded. They're always trying to understand something about themselves and usually never quite making it, never quite getting to the point where they turn their lives around. There's none of that Springsteen widescreen panoramic, we're going to bust out of this town thing. In East River Pipe songs, the people have these thoughts, but they generally don't act on them. There's no real escape. There's just kind of the idea of escape as some hope, some salvation. So this album itself is quite interesting in that it's just format-wise speaking, it's a 10-inch album. Whether you'd want to class that as a mini album or not, I don't know, but it lasts about 28 minutes, which I think puts it over what I would consider the EP and into the album category. And it was released on Sarah Records in the UK, from Bristol in the UK, actually. Very interesting label. This was like the most strongly identifiable UK indie kind of label of the 80s and early 90s. If you think of the words twee and indie, you would be thinking Sarah. Bands like the Field Mice and the Sea Urchins, Heavenly, 40 Nice Bears, the Orchids, and there were a very select few bands or artists from outside the UK who ever released on Sarah, and East River Pipe are one of them. This may be a bit tricky to get hold of, so if you want to find Goodbye California, then luckily it was reissued as a CD with a bunch of bonus tracks, which happened to be the 7-inch singles that he released on Sarah Records around about the time of this album, shortly before, shortly after. And that is called Shining Hours in a Can. So yeah, get that, because the singles are great too. I'm literally just talking about Goodbye California because I'm lucky enough to have a copy of it. So key tracks. I mean, Cornog's just got a very, very identifiable style. It's just a very classic acoustic guitar, some keyboards to fill it out, either a little kind of very low-key live drumming or using some basic drum machines. And he just fills it out to make these sunny pop songs with a very dark undercurrent. 10 take the track Silhouette Town, for instance. I mean, Silhouette Town in this case is any town that would count as suburban America, suburban USA. And it features a classic cornog protagonist, someone who wants to get out, wants to escape, but they find they can't. In fact, the only way they can escape really is through drink or drugs. He continually chronicles the lives of these people who see the possibility of escape but never take it. It's never realized. It's just very beautiful, kind of sad, heartfelt songwriting. I think if I was to say there's any kind of precedent, if there was anyone else I could think that I could liken him to, it would be that kind of less flippant songwriting style that you got from Grant McLennan in the Go-Betweens. So he always had a counterpoint with Robert Forster, I believe, was the other songwriter in the Go-Betweens, who was much more flippant and flamboyant and lyrical. And Grant McLennan was always a little bit more grounded and sweeter sounding. And I get a lot of that from FM Cornog. I mean, similarly, a song like Dog Man is slightly more impressionistic than Silhouette Town, but still very lyrically simple and just devastatingly emotional. He sings, people get inside you. You waited for what you waited for. And it constantly brings up this image of the dog man. It's like someone you see on the street, but they're not really a person. There's someone you can ignore. There's someone who's always there, but you can cast your eyes away and not have to worry about them because they're the dog man. It's almost like they've been dehumanized. That's how it feels. But yeah, it's just, again, a very beautiful, very heartfelt, very warm songwriting, which, although it has a very sad undercurrent, the music just soars. It's beautiful, beautiful music. The track 40 Miles is kind of an epic by Cornog's standards. It goes on for over 7 minutes long, and it begins with some gentle kind of insistent drums which just kind of push the song along. And he starts introducing these lines about saying, you run away from everything. And again, it's a song which is just suffused, steeped with these dreams of escape from something. Even if it's just somewhere that's only 40 miles away. But it's got these beautiful kind of overlapping, intertwining guitar melodies that, as the song kind of stretches out through the verse chorus structure, this wash comes in around the vocals. It's a lovely piece of music. And for someone using such kind of quite simple equipment, such a limited palette, this is why I mentioned lo-fi earlier. This isn't lo-fi music. This is music that's sweated over, and it sounds so warm and beautiful and cared for. It's just great songwriting, just rendered really well. And I think if you want to encapsulate just the whole feel of this album and of Cornog's songwriting, you could say it this time, but I could equally say it about any of his subsequent albums, because he's got a very identifiable style. But the track Make a Deal with the City, again, just these images of cities as a place of promise and that you find yourself in, but once you're there, you haven't got away from the real problem. You're still compromised. It's got this amazing little central guitar riff, which is just happy and jaunty and just bobs through the whole song. It's just wonderful. This has been picked up on soundtracks on a couple of movies and stuff, and you can see why. It's just great songwriting. So yeah, I think FM Cornog, East River Pipe, just a really superb, much underrated songwriter. The last I heard, he doesn't have as much time to write and record music. He never performs live, really. But he doesn't have as much time to write and record because he kind of works a 40-hour shift at his Home Depot. So he's very grounded. He writes when he feels like it. He writes when he feels moved enough to write. But when he does, yeah, you better listen to it because it's some really extraordinary music. So yeah, you know the deal by now. All those suggestions, I'd love it if you did. If you don't have the time, if you don't feel like it, that's fine. Just happy for you to have watched another video. If you liked it, then please come back again and watch another episode with me of 90s Overlooked Underheard. Bye for now.